I'd like to just say that I think that the recognition today of 100 years of hospitality in this building was something that shouldn't have passed unnoticed. And it was brought about years ago, and there's two gentlemen going to speak on the development of the building and how that all came about, and another one that's going to talk about the Seaman's mission and what they do. It was all brought about by people who really cared, going back well over 100 years ago, because this is the third site. The second site was just up the street a little bit above Sabbath's Restaurant, and before that it was up near Coria Street, further across somewhere. But because the shipping coming in here was getting greater, the sailors have been at sea for such an awful long time, the folk in Geelong got together and said, we've got to do something better to support these people. And I know that they were told they were crazy trying to get a site like this, couldn't afford it, wouldn't happen. And I believe dear old King Edward VII got behind as a patron, and then the city supported it, but the public, the Geelong public, raised the funds to actually build it. 3 o'clock on this same day, 100 years ago, Captain Chambers conducted the ceremony from the main door looking out onto Moore Street before 200 people, including the smart guard of naval cadets. He noted that at Admiral Clubhouse Geelong, what an Admiral Clubhouse Geelong had provided for the visiting seamen. Attending there were mostly local clergy and leading public figures. The club included reading, writing facilities together with a refreshment buffet. He offered thanks to the government for the wonderful site for the rest, thanked the people of Geelong for their generosity, and the General Committee, including, and Keith, I want you to note this, Mr. Keith Fagg, our new Mayor, including a Miss Fagg, who I believe was your great auntie. She was here. He also emphasised the difficulty of being a seaman and the debt owed to them by the Australian people. Now also, there was a Mrs. E. Fagg, who I believe is your grandmother.
That's correct.
And she served on the Committee of Sailors' Rest around that time. I think she started about 1900 on the committee. So the Faggs have had a lot to do with supporting the community of Geelong going way back. So they've left you a very big legacy.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Frank.
And I've got to say that Robert Moore, who was the founder of Sailors' Rest, that gentleman, and it's his daughter that you'll see in the photo with the shovel that turned the first site here. We've got here represented today 3 generations of the Moore family coming after Robert, going way back in time. So I think it's a great occasion for us, and I'm looking forward to listening to, first of all, Allan Willingham.
In the 19th century, many ships were held in ports for extended periods, loading cargoes or otherwise seeking out passengers for the return journey to ports in the old country. And it's quite remarkable, you know, how many early settlers here went home, went back and forth to England, Scotland, and to a lesser extent Ireland in the 19th century. We think that once they were here, that was it, but I'm currently researching William Andrew Taylor, a Scottish settler of Canada. He went home 4 times in 6 years with his wife. Departures were sometimes further frustrated when absconders from the crew could not be rounded up from any of the plethora of inns and pubs which sprang up around the bustling ports, and particularly near the shores of Coria Bay and Geelong. And those of you who know the history of this place will know that Coria Street and along Rome Street, the waterfront here, there were a plethora of little pubs that catered specifically for mariners. Temperance was not a word many of the crew understood. And in the 19th century, more than one Geelong publican appeared before local magistrates for supplying liquor after hours to rampant crews on shore. Clearly, sailors on shore were forever exposed to the temptations of life. In fact, in one of the histories of the missions to seamen, they could not resist the scourge. But the temptations of life were otherwise denied them on boarding sailing ships and coastal traders. The countless court records, some of which I've looked here in Geelong, tell the stories of sailors who transgressed whilst on shore. Now, Neil Thomas, who's the current chair of the Missions to Seafarers Incorporated in Geelong, is going to tell you more of the story of the foundation of the Sailors' Rest of Geelong. Firstly at the Bethel Chapel in Coria Street in 1885, and then following a series of public meetings in 1899, the establishment of the Geelong branch of the Victorian Seamen's Mission. So, all I have to say is that this Geelong branch was very similar to those established much earlier at Williamstown in Port Melbourne. And the same practice was adopted. Ships were welcomed upon arrival in port. Invitations were extended for the crew to attend a weekly social, and hospitality was otherwise extended to visiting crew by members of the Geelong Mission. Sailors were offered access to the Ocean Library during their stay at Geelong, and the custom of providing a bag of books on each outgoing ship, which started in 1885, continued well into the 20th century. Picnics, magic, lantern slide nights and occasional lectures were also offered to the officers and crew of the many immigrant ships and cargo vessels which tied up at Geelong in the boom decades of the late 19th and early 20th century. What about this building? Now, you're crying. When I first undertook the documentation of the architectural history of this dear building, we know as the King Edward VII Sailors' Rest, during my study of the historic buildings and places in the Geelong region. That was a study I took 5 years to finish.
Yeah.
Well, therein I wrote, somewhat succinctly I suppose, that, quote, the Premier of Victoria, the Honourable John Murray MLA, laid the foundation stone of the Sailors' Rest at Eastern Beach Parade, Geelong on 3rd of February 1912. This two-storey brick and cement rendered Edwardian period structure was designed by architects Sealy, King and Everett, the design being attributed to Percy Everett. This is an important early work of Everett, notable for the nautical Art Nouveau ornamentation and use of the reinforced concrete in the raft floor slab. The Sailors' Rest, a long-established charitable mission to seamen, is a distinguished Geelong institution, and that was as many letters and words as I was allowed to use with a computer format in those days. Today, some of my colleagues, specialist heritage consultants, would take pages to say the same thing, if not with more sophistication and factual amplification. Now, what about our architect, Percy Edgar Everett? A friend of mine. I seem to know him well. Percy Edgar Everett was an architect and a headmaster. He was born on the 26th of June 1888 at Geelong. He was the seventh child of Joseph and Emma Everett, and Joseph was a blacksmith here in Geelong. Percy Edgar Everett was educated at the Ashby Public School. He was articled to W.H. Cleverton, a Geelong architect, and he studied at the Geelong Technical College. He was employed as an architectural draftsman from 1907 to 1910 by the Geelong Harbour Trust before he joined the firm of Sealy and King. Remember, George King was head of the architecture school at the Gordon Institute, and later again Percy Everett became a partner. And during this early time with Sealy and King, he designed the Sailors' Rest. Well, I don't have to tell you all about Percy Everett. He's well documented. He's in the Australian Dictionary biography. But it's interesting that when work got short during the First World War, he became a headmaster, and he went to Brunswick Technical School. And then later on, he ended up as headmaster of Brighton Tech School, all the time conducting a small architectural practice. And in 1934, Everett was appointed the chief architect in the Victorian Public Works Department. And there he formed his own design division, and he is largely responsible because he was very much a hands-on man who was responsible for everything. Like Kevin Rudd, perhaps. Percy Everett formed a strong design division and was responsible for the design of some of the most important modern style public buildings and schools and courthouses and other public works buildings in Victoria. And his legacy is wide, it's large. But this is, apart from the now lost cargo shed, which was at the end of the Yarra Street pier down here, this is really Percy's first major building. And for that, we have also to appreciate it for what it is. This was sludge, this site. The custom house here was really built on the foreshore, the embankment, and this was all just coastal swamp and sludge. And it was reclaimed. The foundation material here was so bad that Percy introduced Geelong to the concrete raft slab, adopting a German system of reinforcing. And not only that, but it's got a flat roof. Now, architects still haven't perfected the flat roof. But the Hampton Hotel at Camperdown, I long claimed as being the oldest flat roof building that I knew of in the state. But this was built at the same time. So it's also distinguished because of that. Now, as far as the Sailors' Rest is concerned, this building contained reading rooms, a library, a committee room, refreshment room, concert room, which I guess would have been here. It had up-to-date bathrooms with plunge baths. Sailors, mariners no doubt would have relished the idea of a plunge bath. Had caretakers' quarters and electric lighting, because the power station was just over there in Yarra Street at that time. It's also interesting to see that the Sailors' Rest sign, which was installed in 1926, Frank, wasn't it? In 1926, is back in its rightful place. Well, the move to build this place started in 1900. The Geelong Advertiser actually had a competition going at the time for a suitable memorial for the late King Edward VII, but the Sailors' Rest was not high on the public priorities. Nevertheless, the Victorian government granted a site for a new building on this corner site here. Seeley, King and Everett were commissioned to do it, and Percy Everett, as I mentioned, was a precocious young talent, and he was responsible for the design of this new building in then a very fashionable style. One of the nice things about Geelong is it has a wonderful architectural catalogue of styles. You can bring someone here, you can show them an iron building which is unique, Ferrara Villa. You can show them very early colonial stone buildings. You can show them rich, multi-coloured, polychromatic brick buildings like Geelong College. You can show them buildings of the early 20th century and the mid and late 20th century. And even if you're game enough, you can take them around and show them the upturned concrete ziggurat, which is the public office. The flaying of this foundation stone was on the 3rd of February 1912. It was a hot day. It was 107 degrees Fahrenheit, and few turned up. Probably a lot less than here today. And there was a suggestion, as you may or may not know, that the Prince of Wales laid the stone by pressing a distant button in London. And that proved impractical, and the Premier, John Murray, came to Geelong on the flyer and laid the stone, and believe it or not, much to the chagrin of the Geelong Advertiser, he kept the silver trowel. I wonder where it is now, Mr. Minister. I wonder where it is now. Now, the Geelong Advertiser was not, was then, it wasn't backward in coming forward with suggestions like today. And the Geelong Advertiser, knowing it was coming down on the, to lay the foundation stone, in an editorial said that the Premier should see Geelong in all its nakedness. He should go and have a look at the wooden pylons at the wharf, which are rotten. There were not enough sheds on the foreshore, no shelter for passengers or cargo on the wharf, given that 3 steamers berth there every day. Not much had happened since the Geelong Harbour Trust was given so much land and power. He hoped that the Premier travelled by train because, quote, he will find out what it feels like to be delayed for up to 1 hour due to congestion on the line. I used to go home to Canada on that same train line. Nothing's changed, has it really? And he also was encouraged to look at improving the grain handling facilities in the Geelong port. They wanted an agricultural high school in Eaton Gardens. And the road to Colac, especially near Warren Ponds, was a disgrace. Then, as now. So that was what the editorial in the Geelong Advertiser put to the Premier. But the thing that was most interesting from a historical point of view is that they encouraged the government to grant £3,000 for a new art gallery. And of course in 1915-16 that actually eventuated. So, Frank, whilst I might be an out-of-towner, I'm sort of an out-of-towner with a reasonable link to your place. I wanted to congratulate you, not only on looking after this historic place, but having the pride in your building sufficient to, one, mark the exact centenary of this building, and two, to have us all here with wonderful hospitality, which I see your plaque downstairs says has been here for 100 years ago, now 100 years today. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I've given you a little bit about this wonderful building. Thank you.